The cardboard boxes stacked against the espresso machine felt like tombstones marking the death of everything I had worked for. 23 years of 6 a.m. openings, burned fingertips from steam wands, and the careful choreography of morning rushes were about to become nothing more than memory. Cordine's Corner Coffee had been my life since I was 25 years old, and now at 48, I was preparing to say goodbye to the only thing that had ever truly belonged to me. The final day had arrived with the kind of gray October drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there permanently. I had already packed most of the personal items, the photographs of regular customers who had become like family, the handwritten thank you notes that had kept me going through the harder years. The new owners, a chain called Metropolitan Beans, would take possession tomorrow morning, and by tomorrow afternoon, the warm burgundy walls would probably be painted corporate white. The mismatched vintage furniture replaced with sterile modern pieces that looked exactly like every other coffee shop in every other strip mall. I was wiping down the counter for what I thought would be the last time when I heard the desperate rattling of the front door handle. The sign clearly read "closed" and had been flipped for over an hour, but someone was trying to get in with the kind of persistence that suggested emergency or desperation. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see an elderly woman with silver hair that had come undone from what had probably been a careful arrangement earlier in the day. Her coat was soaked through, and even from a distance, I could see that she was crying. My first instinct was to ignore her. I had already turned off the machines, already counted the register for the final time, already said my goodbyes to the handful of afternoon regulars who had stopped by to wish me well. But something about the way she pressed her palms against the glass, the way her shoulders shook with what looked like grief rather than frustration, made me set down my cloth and walk to the door. "We're closed," I called through the glass, not unkindly, but firmly. "I'm sorry, but everything's been shut down for the day." "Please," she said, and her voice carried even through the door in the rain. "Please, I know you're closed, but I need coffee. I need it made just like that day. You have to understand, I've been looking for this place for so long." There was something in her tone that stopped me from walking away. Not just desperation, but a kind of recognition, as if she was talking about something specific, something important that I should understand but didn't. I had never seen this woman before in my life. I was certain of that. In 23 years of running Cordina's Corner, I had memorized the faces and orders of hundreds of customers, and this woman was definitely not among them. But her tears weren't the kind you shed over being denied a simple cup of coffee. These were deeper, older tears, the kind that came from places most people spent their whole lives trying to avoid visiting. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "I can make you coffee," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "But I have to warn you, I've already cleaned most of the machines. It might not be up to our usual standards." She stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floors I had mopped for the final time just an hour before. Up close, she looked to be in her 70s, with the kind of bone structure that suggested she had been beautiful when she was younger. Her eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they held a clarity that seemed at odds with her current emotional state. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching a black leather purse against her chest like it contained something precious. "You don't know what this means to me. You don't know how long I've been searching." I guided her to one of the small tables near the window, the same spot where Mrs. Henley used to sit every Tuesday morning for 15 years until she moved to Florida to live with her daughter. The woman settled into the chair with the careful movements of someone who wasn't entirely steady on her feet, and I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "What kind of coffee can I make for you?" I asked, already mentally calculating which machines I would need to restart and how long it would take. "The same as that day?" she said again, looking at me with such intensity that I felt uncomfortable. "You remember, don't you? The way you made it that morning when everything changed?" I sat down across from her, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, but I think you might have me confused with someone else. I don't recall making coffee for you before, and I'm usually very good with faces." Her expression shifted, confusion replacing certainty. "But this is Cordine's Corner Coffee, isn't it? You're Cordine?" "I'm Serafina," I said gently. "Serafina Evermore. I named the shop after my grandmother, Cordine Maltresse. She died when I was 12, but she was the one who taught me to love coffee. This was her recipe, her way of doing things." The woman's face went very pale, and for a moment I worried she might faint. She stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Maltresse," she whispered finally. "Did you say Maltresse?" "Yes," I confirmed, feeling increasingly uneasy. "Cordine Maltresse was my grandmother. Why? Does that name mean something to you?" Instead of answering, she began digging through her purse with frantic movements, pulling out tissues, reading glasses, a small address book, and finally a photograph that looked like it had been carried around for decades. The edges were worn soft, and the colors had faded to that sepia tone that old pictures get when they've been handled too much. She placed the photograph on the table between us with trembling fingers. "Is this her? Is this your grandmother?" I leaned forward to look at the picture, and my breath caught in my throat. It was definitely my grandmother, but younger than I had ever seen her. She looked to be maybe 25 or 30, standing behind what was obviously a coffee counter, wearing an apron and smiling at the camera. But it wasn't the coffee shop I remembered from my childhood visits. This was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that looked more upscale, more sophisticated than the small neighborhood place where Grandma Cordine had worked when I was little. "Yes," I said slowly, "that's definitely my grandmother. But I don't understand where this picture was taken. This isn't the coffee shop where she worked when I knew her." The elderly woman's tears started fresh, but now they seemed to carry a different emotion. Relief, maybe, mixed with something that looked almost like joy. "She had her own place," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper, "before everything went wrong, before she had to disappear. This was Cordine's first coffee shop, the one she opened in 1967, the one where she made the most perfect coffee I've ever tasted in my life." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. My grandmother had owned her own coffee shop? In all the stories she had told me, all the afternoons we had spent together, learning about coffee beans and brewing methods, she had never mentioned owning her own business. According to family stories, she had always been an employee, never an owner. "I think there's been some mistake," I said carefully. "My grandmother worked for other people her whole life. She never owned a coffee shop. She couldn't have afforded something like that." The woman shook her head vigorously. "No mistake. I was there. I was her regular customer for 3 years, from 1967 until 1970, every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 8:15. She knew my order by heart. Medium roast with a splash of cream and just a touch of cinnamon, but not the regular kind. She had this special blend she imported from somewhere in Central America. She called it her signature drink. My head was spinning. This woman was describing exactly the way my grandmother had made coffee for me during my childhood visits. The special cinnamon blend, the precise measurements, even the timing. But the timeline didn't make sense. In 1970, my grandmother would have been 28 years old, and according to family history, that was around the time she met my grandfather and got married. What happened to the coffee shop? I asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. The woman's expression darkened, and she looked away from me toward the rain-streaked window. There was trouble, bad trouble. Men came asking questions about Cordine, about where she lived, who she knew. They weren't customers. They were the kind of men you don't want asking questions about you. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts or maybe her courage. One morning in September of 1970, I came for my usual coffee, and the shop was empty. Not just closed, but completely empty. All the equipment gone, the furniture gone, even the sign taken down. The landlord said Cordine had broken her lease in the middle of the night and disappeared. He seemed scared, like he didn't want to talk about it. I sat back in my chair, trying to process this information. It sounded like something out of a movie, not like the quiet, stable life my grandmother had always described. But then again, there had always been gaps in her stories, periods of time she would skip over quickly when I asked about her younger days. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What does any of this have to do with coffee today?" The woman reached into her purse again and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping that looked almost as old as the photograph. She unfolded it carefully and placed it next to the picture. "Because 3 days ago, I saw this in the newspaper," she said. A small article about local businesses closing down. And there was your name, Serafina Evermore, and a mention that your coffee shop was named after your grandmother, Cordine Maltresse. I looked down at the newspaper clipping. It was indeed an article about Cordine's Corner Coffee closing, with a quote from me about carrying on my grandmother's legacy. It had run in the local business section, the kind of small piece that most people probably skipped over. "I've been looking for Cordine for 53 years, the woman continued, not actively, not like a detective or anything, but hoping, wondering what happened to her, whether she was safe, whether she was happy. And then I saw this article, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could find some trace of her." The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket. This woman had been carrying around a photograph and a memory for over 5 decades, hoping to solve a mystery that had been bothering her for most of her adult life. And somehow, through pure chance, she had found me on the last day I would ever operate under my grandmother's name. "I don't know what to tell you," I said honestly. "My grandmother never talked about owning her own business or having to disappear from anywhere. She always said she worked for a series of small cafes until she met my grandfather." "Maybe she couldn't tell you," the woman suggested gently. "Maybe it wasn't safe, even years later." The idea that my grandmother might have been keeping secrets, might have been protecting me or the family from something dangerous, was almost impossible to accept. Grandma Cordine had been the most honest person I had ever known, the kind of woman who would admit to you if she had accidentally given you incorrect change, even if it was only a penny. But looking at this photograph, seeing my grandmother in a context I had never imagined, I began to wonder what else I might not have known about the woman who had shaped so much of my understanding of coffee and hospitality. "What's your name?" I asked the woman. "Prudence Carlyle," she said. I was Prudence Whitten back then, before I got married. I lived about 6 blocks from Cordine's shop, and those Tuesday and Friday morning coffees were the highlight of my week. Your grandmother had this way of making you feel like you were the most important customer in the world, like she was genuinely happy to see you every time you walked through the door. I smiled despite my confusion. That sounds exactly like her. She was like that with everyone. "No," Prudence said firmly. She was polite with everyone, professional with everyone, but she was genuinely warm with certain people, and I was lucky enough to be one of them. We talked about books, about music, about our dreams for the future. She wanted to expand her business, open multiple locations, maybe even franchise the concept. She was ambitious in a way that women weren't supposed to be back then. This description of my grandmother as an ambitious businesswoman was so different from the gentle, supportive figure I remembered that I felt like we might be talking about two different people, but the photograph didn't lie, and something in Prudence's voice convinced me that she was telling the truth, at least as she remembered it. "Tell me about that last day," I said, the day before she disappeared. Prudence closed her eyes, and I could see her traveling back through the decades to a morning that had apparently stuck with her all this time. "It was a Friday," she said slowly. "September 18th, 1970. I remember because it was my birthday, and Cordine had made my coffee extra special that day. She used her best beans, the ones she usually saved for special occasions, and she spent extra time with the preparation. She even brought out a small pastry she had made herself, said it was a birthday surprise." She opened her eyes and looked directly at me. But something was wrong. I could tell from the moment I walked in. Cordine kept looking toward the windows, like she was expecting someone or worried about someone, and she seemed nervous, which wasn't like her at all. She was always so composed, so in control of her environment. "Did she say anything about being worried?" "Not directly, but when I was leaving, she did something she had never done before. She walked me to the door and gave me a hug, and she said something strange. She said, 'Prudence, if anything happens to me, I want you to know that making your coffee these past 3 years has been one of the greatest joys of my life.'" The hair on my arm stood up. And that did sound like something my grandmother would say, the kind of heartfelt sentiment she was known for expressing at unexpected moments. I asked her what she meant by "if anything happens," but she just smiled and told me she was being silly. She said she would see me Tuesday morning as usual, but Tuesday morning the shop was empty. We sat in silence for several minutes, the rain continuing to drum against the windows. I found myself staring at the photograph, trying to reconcile this image of my grandmother as a young entrepreneur with the woman who had always seemed content to work for others. "Prudence," I said finally, "I want to make you that coffee, the way my grandmother used to make it. I can't promise it will be exactly the same, but I can try." Her face lit up with such genuine gratitude that I felt tears prick at my own eyes. "Would you really, even though you're closing?" especially because I'm closing," I said, standing up and walking toward the espresso machine. If my grandmother really did disappear to protect herself or her family, then maybe making her coffee one more time is a way of honoring that sacrifice. I restarted the espresso machine and began pulling out ingredients: medium roast beans, which I ground fresh, cream from the small refrigerator I hadn't yet emptied, and from the spice rack behind the counter, the special cinnamon blend that my grandmother had taught me to make when I was 15 years old. As I worked, I found myself thinking about all the stories my grandmother had told me, looking for gaps or inconsistencies I might have missed. There had always been a period from her late 20s to early 30s that she would gloss over quickly, saying only that she had tried a few different things before settling into the steady work that characterized the rest of her career. I had assumed she meant different jobs, different employers, but what if she had meant different locations, different identities, different lives? The coffee began to fill the air with its rich aroma, and I could see Prudence inhaling deeply, her expression becoming almost reverent. I took extra care with every step, measuring the cinnamon precisely, heating the cream to exactly the right temperature, even using the special cup I had been saving for my own final drink at Cordine's Corner. When I placed the coffee in front of Prudence, her hands were shaking again, but this time it seemed to be from emotion rather than age or distress. She lifted the cup to her lips and took a small sip, then closed her eyes and took a larger one. When she opened her eyes again, they were full of tears, but she was smiling. "That's it," she whispered. "That's exactly it. After 53 years, that's exactly how I remember it tasting." I sat back down across from her, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that I had been able to recreate something meaningful from my grandmother's past, and sadness that this might be the last time anyone would ever taste coffee made the way Cordine Maltresse had taught me to make it. "Serafina," Prudence said, setting down her cup carefully, "there's something else, something I haven't told you yet." I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal was the real reason she had been so desperate to get into my shop today. "The men who came asking questions about your grandmother, the ones who scared her enough to make her disappear?" She paused, taking a deep breath. "I think I know who they were, and I think they might have been looking for me." The room seemed to grow quieter, despite the rain still pattering against the windows. "What do you mean?" "My husband," she said quietly. "My first husband, the one I was married to in 1970. He wasn't a good man, Serafina. He was involved with people who did bad things, and he had a temper that got worse when he drank, which was most of the time." She twisted her hands in her lap, clearly struggling with whatever she was about to tell me. I had been planning to leave him for months, but I was scared. Women didn't have the same options then that they do now. I didn't have my own money, my own credit, my own anything, but I had been saving little bits of cash when I could, hiding it in a coffee can under my sink. The irony of hiding money in a coffee can wasn't lost on either of us. I confided in your grandmother. During those Friday morning conversations, I told her about my situation, about my plans to leave. She was so supportive, so encouraging. She even offered to help me find work once I was ready to start over. I was beginning to understand the direction this story was heading, and it made my stomach tighten with dread. "My husband found the money," Prudence continued, And somehow he figured out that I had been getting advice from someone, that I hadn't come up with the idea to leave him all by myself. He started asking around the neighborhood, trying to find out where I spent my time, who I talked to. She picked up the coffee cup again, but didn't drink from it, just held it like it was providing comfort. I think he found out about the coffee shop. I think he and his friends went there looking for me, or looking for information about me. And I think your grandmother realized that helping me had put her in danger. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made horrible sense. My grandmother hadn't just disappeared to protect herself. She had disappeared to protect Prudence, and probably to protect whatever new life Prudence was trying to build away from an abusive marriage. "Did you leave him?" I asked. "Eventually," she said. "It took me another 6 months to work up the courage, but yes, I finally left. I moved across the country, changed my name when I remarried a few years later, started completely over. But I never stopped feeling guilty about what happened to Cordine. I never stopped wondering if she was safe." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "You couldn't have known what would happen, and my grandmother would never have blamed you for the actions of violent men." "I know that intellectually," Prudence said, "but guilt doesn't always listen to logic. For 53 years, I've carried the weight of wondering whether my problems cost your grandmother her business, her home, maybe even her safety." We sat together in the growing darkness, two women separated by more than 20 years in age, but connected by the legacy of someone who had tried to help a stranger in need. Outside, the rain was beginning to slow, and the street lights were starting to flicker on. "Prudence," I said finally, "I want you to know that whatever happened back then, my grandmother lived a good life afterward. She married my grandfather in 1972, had my father in 1974, and worked steadily until she retired. She died peacefully in her sleep when I was 25. She got to see me open this coffee shop, and she was proud of what I was building." The relief that crossed Prudence's face was profound. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much I needed to hear that." I looked around the coffee shop one more time, taking in the familiar details that would be gone forever by tomorrow evening. But something had shifted in the past hour. What had felt like an ending was beginning to feel like something else, something I couldn't quite name yet. "Prudence," I said slowly, "can I ask you something? That newspaper article where you found my name, did you happen to read the whole thing?" She nodded. "Of course. Why? Do you remember what it said about why I was closing?" She thought for a moment. "Something about not being able to compete with the big chains, about the rent being too high and the customer base not being strong enough to sustain an independent business." "That's right," I confirmed. "But what the article didn't mention is that I've been struggling to find meaning in what I do. Not financially, not practically, but emotionally. I've been feeling like I'm just going through the motions, like the coffee shop has become just a job instead of a calling." Prudence leaned forward, clearly interested in where this was heading. "But sitting here with you tonight, making that coffee the way my grandmother taught me, hearing your story about how much those Friday morning conversations meant to you," I paused, trying to find the right words. "It reminded me why coffee shops exist in the first place. Not just to sell drinks, but to create spaces where people can connect, where they can find support, where they can be seen and heard." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where the rain was finally beginning to stop. What if I don't sell to Metropolitan Beans? What if I find a way to keep Cordine's Corner open, but do it differently? What if I make it the kind of place where people like you can come to share their stories, where people like my grandmother can offer help to those who need it? When I turned around, Prudence was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You would do that?" she asked. "You would give up the security of selling to a corporate buyer to keep this little place alive?" "Maybe," I said, the idea gaining strength as I spoke it out loud. "I have until tomorrow morning to make a final decision. The contracts aren't signed yet." Prudence finished her coffee and set the cup down with a satisfied sigh. "That was perfect," she said. "Exactly like I remembered. If you can make coffee that brings back 53-year-old memories, then you have a gift worth preserving." As she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Serafina," she said, "would it be all right if I came back sometime? If you do decide to keep the shop open, I mean. I'd like to be a regular customer again, like I was with your grandmother." "I would love that," I said, meaning it completely. After she left, I stood alone in the coffee shop, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of 23 years of memories. But for the first time in months, the space didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a possibility. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for my lawyer. It was late, but I knew she checked her messages even after hours. I left a voicemail asking her to call me first thing in the morning, saying I needed to discuss delaying the sale until I could explore some other options. Then I walked to the counter and picked up tomorrow's newspaper, which had been delivered while Prudence and I were talking. I usually didn't read the morning edition until I was having my own coffee the next day, but something made me want to look at it now. I flipped through the first few pages absently, not really focusing on the headlines. But when I reached the local news section, a small article near the bottom of the page caught my attention. The headline read, "Local Woman's 50-Year Search Ends in Tragedy." My hands began to shake as I read the first paragraph. It was about Prudence Carlile, describing how she had been searching for decades for information about a woman named Cordine Maltresse, who had disappeared from her coffee shop in 1970. But according to the article, Prudence had died 3 days ago in a car accident while driving to visit a coffee shop she believed might have some connection to the woman she had been seeking. The newspaper slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. I stared at the door through which Prudence had just walked, my mind refusing to process what I had just read. The article was dated today, but it was describing events that had happened 3 days ago. It was describing the death of a woman who had just been sitting across from me, drinking coffee and sharing memories of my grandmother. I picked up the newspaper with trembling hands and read the article again, more carefully this time. There was no mistake. Prudence Carlile, age 76, had died on October 15th in a single car accident on Highway 47. She had been on her way to visit Cordine's Corner Coffee in response to a business closure announcement she had seen in the newspaper, but that was impossible. I had just spent over an hour talking with her. I had made her coffee. I had touched her hand. She had left a wet spot on my floor from her rain-soaked coat. I looked toward the table where she had been sitting, and my breath caught in my throat. The coffee cup was gone. The photograph was gone. the newspaper clipping was gone. There was no trace that anyone had been there at all, except for the lingering scent of that special cinnamon blend hanging in the air. I ran to the door and pulled it open, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was empty, no sign of an elderly woman in a rain-soaked coat, no footprints on the wet sidewalk, no evidence that anyone had been there moments before. My heart was pounding as I went back inside and checked every corner of the coffee shop, looking for some proof that Prudence Carlyle had been real, that our conversation had actually happened. But there was nothing. Even the cup I had specially prepared for her was back in its place behind the counter, clean and dry as if it had never been used. I sank into the chair where she had been sitting and stared at the newspaper article again, reading every word multiple times. The details were specific, undeniable. Prudence Carlyle had died 3 days ago while searching for information about my grandmother, the woman I had just spoken with, the woman who had shared 53-year-old memories and drunk coffee made exactly the way she remembered it, had been dead for 3 days, but somehow, impossibly, she had found her way to Cordine's Corner Coffee on the last night it would ever bear my grandmother's name. Somehow, she had gotten the answers she had been seeking for over half a century, and somehow I had been given a glimpse into the hidden history of the woman who had shaped my understanding of what it meant to serve others. The newspaper crinkled in my shaking hands as I tried to make sense of what had just happened and what it might mean for the decision I now had to make about the future of my grandmother's legacy. I set the paper down on the counter and walked slowly through the coffee shop, my fingertips trailing along the familiar surfaces. The espresso machine still hummed quietly from being restarted, though I had thought I turned it off after making Prudence's coffee. The scent of that special cinnamon blend lingered in the air, stronger than it should have been after so much time had passed. My phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer, Miranda Ashworth, even though it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Got your voicemail. Interesting timing. The Metropolitan Beans people called this afternoon wanting to accelerate the closing. They're offering an additional $15,000 to finalize everything by tomorrow morning instead of next week. Something about securing the location before a competitor makes a move. Call me first thing tomorrow. I stared at the message, feeling like the universe was testing me. Just hours ago, I had been resigned to selling, ready to walk away from everything my grandmother had inspired me to build. But now, with the memory of Prudence's visit still vivid in my mind, despite its impossibility, the idea of handing Cordine's Corner over to a corporate chain felt like a betrayal of something much larger than my own financial security. I locked the front door and turned off all the lights except for the small lamp behind the counter. Then I sat down in the chair where Prudence had been sitting and tried to think clearly about what had just occurred. Either I was losing my mind, which seemed unlikely given how lucid and detailed our conversation had been, or something extraordinary had happened that I didn't have the vocabulary to explain. But perhaps explanation wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was what Prudence had told me about my grandmother's hidden past and what that meant for how I understood my own purpose. I pulled out my laptop and began searching for information about coffee shops in the area during the late 1960s and early 70s. It took nearly an hour of digging through archived newspaper files and city business records, but eventually I found what I was looking for. There it was, In the business license records for 1967, Cordine's Place, owned and operated by Cordine Maltresse, located on Elmwood Avenue in the Riverside District. The address was only about 12 miles from where I now sat, though that neighborhood had been completely redeveloped in the 1980s and no longer contained any of the original buildings. I found more records showing the business had operated successfully for 3 years before abruptly closing in September of 1970. There was no indication of financial trouble, no record of bankruptcy or legal proceedings. One day, the business was active, and the next day the license had been surrendered and the property vacated. Then I found something that made my heart race. In the archived social pages of the local newspaper from 1969, there was a small photograph of a charity event held at various local businesses. The caption read, "Cordine Maltresse, owner of Cordine's Place Coffee Shop, serves refreshments to volunteers from the Women's Crisis Center during their weekly planning meeting." The Women's Crisis Center. I knew that organization. It still existed today, though it had evolved and expanded over the decades. They provided support and resources for women escaping domestic violence, women seeking job training and financial independence, women who needed safe spaces to rebuild their lives. The pieces were falling into place. My grandmother hadn't just been serving coffee to paying customers. She had been providing a safe haven for women like Prudence, women who needed somewhere to go while they planned their escape from dangerous situations. And when helping those women had put her own safety at risk, she had chosen to disappear rather than stop helping or put them in further danger. I spent the next 2 hours researching everything I could find about the Women's Crisis Center, about domestic violence resources in the 1970s, about the challenges women faced when trying to leave abusive relationships during that era. What I learned painted a picture of my grandmother as someone far more courageous and socially conscious than I had ever imagined. According to the organization's archived newsletters, which had been digitized and made available online, Cordine's Place had been an unofficial meeting point for women seeking help. The coffee shop's owner was praised repeatedly for her discretion, her generosity, and her willingness to provide a safe space for difficult conversations. One newsletter from 1969 included a quote that gave me chills. Cordine Maltresse understands that sometimes the most important thing a business can do is create space for people to find the courage to change their lives. Her coffee shop has become a beacon of hope for women who thought they had nowhere to turn. By midnight, I had filled 3 pages of a notebook with information, connections, and ideas. I had also made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. I was going to keep Cordine's Corner Coffee open, but I wasn't going to run it the same way I had been running it for the past 23 years. I was going to transform it into something that honored my grandmother's true legacy, something that would serve the community in the way she had intended. The next morning, I called Miranda Ashworth before she had even arrived at her office. "Serafina?" she answered, clearly surprised to hear from me so early. "I hope you're calling to tell me you want to take Metropolitan Beans up on their increased offer." "Actually," I said, "I'm calling to tell you I'm withdrawing from the sale entirely." There was a long pause. "Are you sure about this? Because once you reject their offer, they're not going to wait around for you to change your mind again. This is a very competitive market, and they have other locations they're considering." I'm sure, I said, feeling more confident than I had in months. But I need to ask you about something else. What would be involved in converting the business into a nonprofit organization? Another pause, longer this time. A nonprofit? Serafina, that's a completely different legal structure with entirely different tax implications and operational requirements. Can I ask what's prompted this sudden change of direction? I looked around the coffee shop, which looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but somehow felt completely different. I want to honor my grandmother's memory by continuing work she started but had to abandon. I want to create a space where women can access resources, support, and community while enjoying good coffee and feeling safe. Miranda's voice took on the tone she used when she was trying to talk clients out of potentially problematic decisions. That's a beautiful sentiment. But do you have any idea how much work is involved in establishing and running a nonprofit? The paperwork alone could take months, and you'd need to develop a board of directors, establish bylaws, create a mission statement, apply for tax-exempt status. I know it won't be easy, I interrupted, but I've already started researching what would be required, and I think I can make it work. The question is whether you're willing to help me figure out the legal aspects. I could hear her typing in the background, probably looking up information about nonprofit conversions. Let me do some research and get back to you this afternoon. In the meantime, I need to call Metropolitan Beans and formally withdraw your property from consideration. Are you absolutely certain about this? I've never been more certain about anything in my life, I said. After hanging up with Miranda, I spent the morning contacting people I thought might be willing to help with my new venture. I called the current director of the Women's Crisis Center and explained what I was trying to do. To my surprise and delight, she was immediately enthusiastic about the possibility of partnering with a community business that could provide informal meeting space and a supportive environment for their clients. What you're describing sounds exactly like what we've been hoping to find, she said. We've outgrown our current facility, and we've been looking for ways to expand our programming into the community. A coffee shop environment would be perfect for some of our support groups and educational workshops. I also called my insurance agent, my accountant, and the owner of the building where Cordine's Corner was located. Everyone had questions, concerns, and warnings about the challenges I would face. But no one told me it was impossible, and several people offered to help however they could. By afternoon, I had 15 pages of notes and a rough timeline for the transition. Miranda called back with more detailed information about the legal requirements for nonprofit status, and while it was indeed complicated and time-consuming, it wasn't prohibitively difficult. The biggest challenge, she explained, will be funding. Nonprofits can't just rely on coffee sales to cover their operating expenses. You'll need grants, donations, fundraising events, maybe some fee-for-service programming. Do you have any ideas about how you'll generate sustainable revenue? I had been thinking about that question all day. I want to keep the coffee shop operating as a social enterprise. We'll sell coffee and pastries like always, but we'll also offer catering services for events, coffee and business skills workshops, maybe even a small retail section featuring products made by women in our programs. As I spoke, I could see the vision taking shape more clearly. And I want to create a scholarship fund for women who are starting over. Maybe partnering with the community college to provide job training or helping women start their own small businesses. It sounds like you've given this a lot of thought, Miranda said. But I have to ask, Where is this sudden passion coming from? Yesterday you were ready to sell and move on, and today you're talking about transforming your business into a complex nonprofit operation. I hesitated, trying to find a way to explain Prudence's visit without sounding like I had lost my grip on reality. I learned some things about my grandmother yesterday that made me realize I hadn't been fully understanding what she wanted me to carry forward. I think I've been running her coffee shop without really understanding her values or her vision. And you think a nonprofit structure will better reflect those values? I think creating a space where women can find support and resources while building community over good coffee is exactly what she would have wanted, I said. And I think I owe it to her memory to try. Miranda agreed to begin the paperwork for nonprofit incorporation with the understanding that it would take several months to complete and that I would need to continue operating as a for-profit business in the meantime. She also connected me with a consultant who specialized in helping businesses transition to nonprofit status. 3 weeks later, I was standing behind the counter at 7 in the morning, preparing for what would be the first of many community information meetings about the new direction for Cordine's Corner Coffee. I had spent those 3 weeks researching, planning, and reaching out to potential partners and supporters. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, though I was still nervous about whether people would actually show up. At 7:15, Margaret Chen from the Women's Crisis Center arrived with a box of flyers and a warm smile. "I can't tell you how excited our board is about this partnership," she said, arranging informational materials on a table near the window. "We've already had 12 women ask about when your support groups will begin meeting." By 7:30, the coffee shop was busier than it had been on most days during the past 6 months. Women of all ages filled the tables, some with notebooks and pens, others with friends or family members, all curious about what the new Cordine's Corner Coffee would offer. I stood at the front of the room, feeling more nervous than I had when I first opened the coffee shop 23 years earlier. But as I looked out at the faces of the women who had come to learn about our plans, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: absolute certainty that I was doing exactly what I was meant to be doing. 23 years ago, I began, I opened this coffee shop to honor my grandmother, Cordine Maltresse, who taught me that good coffee is about more than just the beans or the brewing method. It's about creating space for people to connect, to share their stories, and to support each other through whatever challenges they're facing. I paused, thinking about Prudence and the conversation that had changed everything. Recently, I learned that my grandmother's original coffee shop, which operated in the late 1960s, served as an informal support center for women who were trying to change their lives. She understood that sometimes people need more than just a good cup of coffee. Sometimes they need a safe place to talk, to plan, to find the courage to take the next step. The room was completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the scratch of pens on paper as people took notes. We're transforming Cordine's Corner Coffee into a nonprofit organization that will continue serving great coffee while also providing resources, support groups, educational workshops, and community connections for women at all stages of their lives. I continued, whether you're starting over after a major life change, looking to develop new skills, hoping to start your own business, or simply wanting to connect with other women in the community, we want this to be a place where you feel welcomed and supported. Margaret Chen stood up to explain the programs the Women's Crisis Center would be offering at the coffee shop. Weekly support groups for women leaving abusive relationships, financial planning workshops, job search assistance, and childcare during evening events. Then, Dr. Patricia Voss from the community college described the professional development classes they would be teaching: computer skills, small business management, resume writing, and interview preparation. As the meeting continued, I watched the faces of the women in the room. I saw excitement, hope, and something else that took me a moment to identify: recognition. These women understood what we were trying to create because they had experienced the need for it themselves. After the formal presentation ended, people lingered to ask questions, share their own stories, and volunteer to help with various aspects of the transition. A retired teacher offered to lead a creative writing group. A small business owner volunteered to mentor women who wanted to start their own enterprises. A social worker suggested additional community partnerships that could expand our reach. By 9:30, when the last person finally left, I had filled 4 pages with contact information for potential volunteers, program participants, and community partners. More importantly, I had confirmation that Cordine's Corner Coffee would indeed fill a need that existed in our community. I was cleaning coffee cups and wiping down tables when I noticed someone had left behind a small, leather-bound notebook. I opened it to see if there was any identifying information inside and found a name written on the first page: Prudence Whitten Carlisle. My hands began to tremble as I flipped through the pages. The notebook contained what appeared to be decades of journal entries, written in the careful handwriting I had seen on that photograph 3 weeks earlier. The entries began in 1967 and chronicled Prudence's visits to my grandmother's original coffee shop, her growing friendship with Cordine, her struggles with her abusive marriage, and her eventual escape. But it also contained entries from much later dates, documenting Prudence's successful career as a social worker, her remarriage to a kind man named Robert Carlisle, her work with domestic violence survivors, and her decades-long search for information about the woman who had helped her find the courage to change her life. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death, and it made my throat tighten with emotion. Tomorrow, I'm driving to visit a coffee shop that might have some connection to Cordine Maltresse. After 53 years, I may finally get answers about what happened to the woman who saved my life. I've spent my career helping other women find the strength to leave dangerous situations, just as she helped me. If I do find her or her family, I want them to know that her kindness changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of women I've been able to help because of the example she set. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, finally understanding why Prudence had appeared to me that night. She hadn't just come seeking closure about my grandmother's disappearance. She had come to pass along a message about the ripple effects of kindness, about how one person's willingness to help can echo through generations. The notebook wasn't just Prudence's personal journal. It was proof that my grandmother's brief time as a coffee shop owner had indeed made a lasting difference. It was validation that the work I was now undertaking would honor not just Cordine's memory, but also the memory of all the women like Prudence who had found hope and support in that original coffee shop. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Cordine's Corner Coffee had officially become a nonprofit organization with a board of directors that included Margaret Chen, Dr. Patricia Voss, and 5 other women who were passionate about our mission. We had received grants from 3 local foundations, donations from dozens of community members, and a matching fund pledge from a successful businesswoman who had herself once needed a second chance. The coffee shop looked similar to how it had always looked, but it hummed with a different kind of energy. On any given day, you might find a job search support group meeting at the large table near the window, a financial planning workshop taking place in the back room, or a small business mentoring session happening over coffee and pastries. We had helped 18 women find employment, provided scholarships for 7 women to attend community college courses, and supported 4 women in starting their own small businesses. The coffee sales had actually increased rather than decreased as word spread about our mission, and people sought us out specifically because they wanted to support what we were doing. But perhaps most importantly, Cordine's Corner Coffee had become what my grandmother had originally envisioned, a place where women could find both excellent coffee and the support they needed to change their lives. On the 6-month anniversary of our nonprofit incorporation, I was working alone in the coffee shop after hours, updating grant reports and preparing for the next day's programming. I had Prudence's journal open beside me, using her detailed accounts of my grandmother's methods to guide some of our current practices. As I worked, I became aware that I was no longer alone. I looked up to see a woman standing near the front door, though I was certain I had locked it hours earlier. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and scared eyes. She was dressed in clothes that looked expensive but disheveled, and she was carrying a small suitcase. "Are you open?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not officially," I said, standing up and walking toward her. "But if you need coffee, I can make you some. Or if you need something else, I can try to help with that too." She looked around the coffee shop, taking in the posted information about our programs, the photographs of women who had participated in our workshops, the bulletin board covered with success stories and thank you notes. "I saw the lights on," she said, "and I saw the sign that says you help women." I didn't know where else to go. I recognized the expression on her face, the mixture of desperation and hope that I had learned to identify over the past 6 months. "You came to the right place," I said. "Why don't you have a seat, and I'll make you something warm to drink. Then you can tell me what kind of help you need." As I prepared coffee using my grandmother's special blend, I thought about Prudence's final journal entry and the legacy of kindness that had brought both of us to this moment. This young woman didn't know it yet, but she had walked into a space created specifically for people like her, people who needed more than just coffee, but weren't sure how to ask for it. When I placed the coffee in front of her, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure anyone would help me." "That's what we're here for," I replied, sitting down across from her, just as I had with Prudence 6 months earlier. "Take all the time you need and tell me how we can help." Outside, the October rain was beginning to fall again, but inside Cordine's Corner Coffee, another woman was about to discover that she wasn't alone, that there were people willing to help her find her way to safety and independence. And somewhere, I knew my grandmother and Prudence were watching with satisfaction, knowing that Their shared vision of using coffee to create community and support was continuing to unfold exactly as they had hoped. The newspaper from that fateful night still sat in my desk drawer, along with Prudence's journal and the photograph of my grandmother's original coffee shop. They served as daily reminders that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're least expecting them, and that the most meaningful work we do might be the natural continuation of efforts started long before we were born. As I listened to this new young woman begin to tell her story, I understood that Cordini's Corner Coffee had finally become what it was always meant to be. Not just a business, but a bridge between women who needed help and women who were ready to provide it, all connected by the simple act of sharing coffee and the complicated act of sharing hope.